As 21st century Christians, there is much that we can learn from those who've gone before us. So please join us as we hear from Reverend Dr. Ian Maddock from Sydney Missionary and Bible College as he talks to us about what we can learn from the life and legacy of two great Christians who have gone before us, George Whitefield and Selina, the Countess of Hutingdon.
Whitefield. In June 1919, an 8-foot-tall bronze statue of the Reverend George Whitefield was dedicated on the campus of the University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, an institution that Whitefield had indirectly helped create with Benjamin Franklin in the middle of the 18th century. The sculpture visualized Whitefield, a transatlantic preaching celebrity and one of the founding fathers of the evangelical movement, preaching in full dramatic flow, clutching a Bible in his left hand and pointing to the heavens with his right, as his gown billowed in the wind. If you've read any books published by the Banner of Truth Trust, you'll recognize that image. If you haven't, no worries. The inscription on the statue emphasizes, or should I say emphasized, past tense, Whitefield's identity and vocation, a humble disciple of Jesus Christ and eloquent preacher of the gospel. One aspect of Whitefield's ministry that isn't mentioned on his statue was his enthusiastic support for the introduction of slavery into the colony of Georgia in the 1740s, as well as the fact that he owned slaves himself. Fast forward to June 2020, just a few years back, and these skeletons in Whitefield's closet were suddenly thrust into the spotlight when, in the midst of a wider national controversy in the United States at the time surrounding the place of systemic racism in that country, the University of Pennsylvania announced that it was removing Whitefield's statue. They were tearing it down. In a public statement, the university's leadership argued that his pro-slavery stance was, quote, undeniably one of Whitefield's principal legacies. They concluded that there is absolutely no justification for having a statue honouring him at Penn. Just a few months later, in September, the celebrations to commemorate the 250th anniversary of Whitefield's death in Newburyport, Massachusetts, where he's buried, were also recalibrated to factor in his role in perpetuating slavery throughout the British Empire. Rebranded as the Great Awakening meets a Just Awakening, the event sought to honour Whitefield's legacy as a life-changing, history-making evangelist, but in such a way as to also acknowledge that his advocacy of slavery was tragically inconsistent with his message of the gospel's radical inclusivity. All of which begs the question for us tonight, what on earth do we now do with George Whitefield? For so long venerated as an evangelical hero, a role model for warm-hearted Calvinism and evangelistic zeal, have we unwittingly been celebrating a villain this whole time? So to cancel or not to cancel George, that's the question before us in this first half hour. It's worth noting at the outset that as far back as his own lifetime, people have been wanting to cancel Whitefield for his views on slavery, though for very different reasons compared to today. Back in 1740, during his first trailblazing tour of the American colonies, Whitefield took aim at southern slave owners, criticising them not for owning slaves per se, but for the way in which they treated them. Quote, God has a quarrel with you for your abuse of and cruelty to the poor Negroes, he wrote in a lengthy public letter directed at slave masters in the southern states of Maryland, Virginia, and the Carolinas. In a society where slaves were typically viewed as having more worth than other creatures, but less worth than white people, Whitefield accused his readers of oppressing those who, quote, work as hard, if not harder, than the horses you ride. Your dogs are cared for and fondled at your tables, but your slaves, who are frequently styled dogs or beasts, have not an equal privilege. They are scarce permitted to pick up the crumbs which fall from their masters' tables. Worse, slave masters added physical abuse to their neglect. Quote, some, as I've been informed by an eyewitness, have been, upon the most trifling provocation, cut with knives and have had forks thrown into their flesh. Given all this, Whitefield poignantly wondered that we have not more instances of self-murder, suicide, amongst the Negroes, or that they have not more frequently risen up in arms against their owners. And yet, there were limits, tellingly, to his empathy. Perhaps sensing at this point in his letter that his readers might suspect him of promoting a radical abolitionist agenda, Whitefield's courage and sympathy faltered, and he made it very clear that he still supported the institutional status quo. Slave abuse was bad, but he nevertheless prayed that slaves, quote, may never be permitted to get the upper hand. Though he did add, pointedly, given a recent slave uprising that had taken place in South Carolina in 1739, that, quote, should such a thing be permitted by Providence, all good men must acknowledge the judgment would be just. Even more serious, in Whitefield's view, was the way that these slave masters neglected their slaves spiritually. Quote, enslaving or misusing their bodies, comparatively speaking, he wrote, would be an inconsiderable evil, was proper care taken of their souls. And so he urged slave masters to view slaves as fellow image bearers of God. A self-evident statement to our ears, but back then, not so much. Quote, blacks are just as much and no more conceived and born in sin as white men are, he wrote. I'm apt to think that whenever the gospel is preached with power amongst them, that many will be brought effectually home to God. But suppose some slaves did become Christians. Wouldn't their experience of spiritual liberation translate into an appetite for emancipation, for physical liberation? Whitefield responded to this. I challenge the world to produce a single instance of a Negro's being made a thorough Christian and thereby made a worse servant. It cannot be. In other words, he looked, as he read the Bible, he saw it supporting and conserving 18th century social structures. When it came to reaching America's black slave population with the gospel, Whitefield practiced what he preached. In one famous sermon he preached in 1740, he applied his message, as he drew the sermon to a close, he applied it to different demographics within the audience before him. He applied the passage to young men, to young maidens, to you of a middle age, to grey-headed sinners, to little children, and last but not least, he has a special segment of application to slaves. I must not forget the poor Negroes. No, I must not, he concluded. Now, lest anyone come away thinking that Whitefield included them as an afterthought, he said, nor do I mention you last because I despise your souls, but because I would have what I shall say make the deeper impression upon your hearts. Not only did he reinforce that Jesus' atoning death was just as much for them as well as for others, Whitefield was adamant that they possessed the same inherent dignity and worth as those who were free. Referring to Galatians 3:28, he wrote, for in Jesus Christ there's neither male nor female, bond nor free. Even you may be the children of God if you believe in Jesus. Now, meanwhile, as he was preaching this sermon, he's also overseeing the construction of an orphanage that he had set up near Savannah, Georgia. This orphanage he called Bethesda. The project was an economic millstone around his neck from the get-go, and in due course, in time, it became a moral millstone as well, as we'll see. The cost of labour, especially white labour, he specifically pointed out, was prohibitively high in Georgia. Quote, the produce of the land cultivated by white servants will scarcely furnish them with ordinary food and raiment. exclusive of the expense of sickness and wages. I cannot see how it's possible for the colony to subsist on its present footing. In case readers missed his point, even at this early stage of his American ministry, Whitefield was crystal clear. Georgia needed to allow slaves if it was going to survive. As for the manuring more land than the hired servants can manage, I think it's impracticable without a few Negroes. It will in no wise answer the expense, he wrote. And in contrast to their neighbours in South Carolina, just to the north, Georgia was established in the 1730s as a slave-free colony, not because of any enlightened abolitionist convictions, it ought to be noted, but instead because they feared that having slaves jeopardised the colony's ability to defend itself against foreign invasion, especially with the Spanish lurking just further to the south in Florida. Quote, experience hath shown that the manner of settling colonies and plantations with black slaves hath obstructed the increase of English and Christian inhabitants therein, who alone can, in case of a war, be relied on for the defence and security of the same. So contrary to what you might sometimes hear, Georgia was not set up as an anti-slave colony because of any enlightened sentiments. It was purely for reasons of self-defence. That being said, public opinion was always against the Georgia trustees' legislation. If the colony was going to survive economically, argued white business owners, it needed to embrace slavery. And so between 1735, when this colony was first settled, all the way through to 1750, when the legislation was eventually overturned, hundreds of petitions and reports crossed the Atlantic, to the point that the House of Commons in London began to lose patience in the trustees' ability to manage this colony. Throughout the 1740s, Whitefield added his voice to this persistently shrill chorus, advocating for the reversal of the 1735 Act. As we've seen, he'd never been wholly averse to the practice of slavery itself, only its excesses and abuses. And now as the 1740s progressed, and as Bethesda, his orphanage's financial fortunes, hung in the balance, he became more and more convinced of slavery's necessity. Up until this point, Whitefield had resisted becoming a slave master himself, but in 1747, even this changed. He bought a plantation in next door South Carolina, just over the border, just further north, that he named Providence. Maybe an effort on his part to baptise his decision with divine blessing, approval. Securing the long-term economic stability of Bethesda was paramount in making this decision, justifying his momentous choice as the product of Georgia's very bad constitution. He wrote that God has put it into the hearts of my South Carolina friends to contribute liberally towards purchasing a plantation and slaves in this province, which I purposed to devote to the support of Bethesda. Otherwise, I'm going to use the profits that I make from this Bethesda, South Carolina plantation to bankroll Bethesda. Quote, bought at a very cheap rate. The plantation consisted of 640 acres of excellent land, he wrote. In almost an aside, he added fatefully, one Negro has also been given to me. There weren't many prepared to call Whitefield out on this, to oppose him during the first half of the 18th century, but there were a few. Some of them knew Whitefield personally, and they tried to steer him away from this decision. One vocal critic of Whitefield's pro-slavery trajectory was the French-American Quaker and abolitionist Anthony Benezet. In 1775, 5 years after Whitefield had died, Benezet wrote to Selina, the Countess of Hutingdon, who we'll hear a bit more about tonight, offering her a candid explanation for this discernible migration in Whitefield's attitude towards slavery. Quote, he at first saw the iniquity of this horrible abuse of the human race, as manifestly appears in the letter he published on that subject, Benezet observed, referring to the public letter that Whitefield had written to the southern slave masters in 1740 that we heard about earlier. But Whitefield's relative clarity of moral vision had become dulled over time, suggested Benezet. Quote, after residing in Georgia and being habituated to the sight and use of slaves, his judgment became so much influenced as to defend the use of slaves. This was a matter of much concern to me, and which I repeatedly, with brotherly freedom, expressed to him. In other words, the more Whitefield saw slavery firsthand, instead of steering him away from it, just convinced him more and more of its necessity. Whitefield brushed off Benezet's entreaties. On December 6, 1748, he appealed to the trustees, the Georgia trustees, no doubt aware of the significant political clout that he exerted. By this stage, the orphanage was one of the colony's largest employers, providing jobs and education and religious services for Georgians. He wrote this to them, I need not inform you, honoured gentlemen, how the colony of Georgia has been declining for these many years, and at what great disadvantages I have maintained a large family in that wilderness. He laid out his allegiance to the colony, but he also what he saw as the roadblocks that the Georgia authorities were putting in his way. Quote, upwards of £5,000 have been expended in that undertaking, and yet very little proficiency made in the cultivation of my tract of land, and that entirely owing to the necessity I lay under of making use of white hands. Whitefield's proposed solution was simple. Quote, had a Negro been allowed, I should now have had a sufficiency to support a great many orphans without expending above half the sum which hath been laid out. He was quick to contrast Bethesda's financial struggles with the success of his plantation in South Carolina, where Negroes are allowed, he said. Even though I have only 8 working hands, yet in all probability there will be more raised in 1 year, and with a quarter the expense, than has been produced at Bethesda for several years. So he was willing to comply with the current legislation as long as it remained in place. He wrote, I am determined that not one of my slaves shall ever be allowed to work at the orphan house till I can do it in a legal manner, he wrote. But all this professed loyalty aside, he also issued a scarcely veiled threat that unless the trustees altered their legislation, he would be forced to seriously consider moving his business elsewhere, that elsewhere being north of the border into South Carolina. I'm as willing as ever to do all I can for Georgia and the orphan house, if either a limited use of Negroes is approved of or some more indented servants sent over. If not, I cannot promise to keep any large family or cultivate the plantation in any considerable manner. My strength must necessarily be taken to the other side, South Carolina. It's hard to say how decisive Whitefield's lobbying proved to be in the trustees' decision to eventually change course and allow slavery. But what is clear is that when the legislation was formally overturned on the 1st of January 1751, Whitefield celebrated the news as a mark of divine blessing. Quote, thanks be to God that the time for favouring that colony seems to be come. I think now is the season for us to exert our utmost for the good of the poor Ethiopians. We are told that even they are soon to stretch out their hands unto God, and who knows but their being settled in Georgia may be overruled for this great end. A decade earlier, he'd balked at saying whether he thought the Bible endorsed slavery. But now, and coinciding with his freedom to introduce slaves onto his land, Whitefield was ready to declare his hand. Quote, as for the lawfulness of keeping slaves, I have no doubt. As always, Whitefield's instinct was to go to the Bible in order to justify his actions. And so when he read Scripture and he saw examples of slavery in the Old and New Testament, he interpreted them as proof that not only did the Scriptures describe this institution as it occurred in the ancient world, it also prescribed, permitted, endorsed its continuation in his own time and place. I hear of some that were bought with Abraham's money and some that were born in his house, he ventured, rehearsing possible evidence for slavery as far back as Genesis. And the decades that followed Whitefield's death, evangelicals like John Wesley and John Newton and William Wilberforce pushed back on Whitefield's interpretation of Scripture. But it has to be said that Whitefield's position during his lifetime was not particularly unusual. In fact, his beliefs were by and large the norm, shared by other first-generation evangelical heroes like Jonathan Edwards. Edwards and Whitefield shared lots in common theologically, and they also shared lots in common when it came to slavery. Both believed that although the slave trade was immoral because it violated the injunction against men stealers in 1 Timothy 1, slave owning itself wasn't prohibited, they argued, conceding that, quote, they are brought in a wrong way from their own country and it's a trade not to be approved of. In Whitefield's thinking, slavery was a God-ordained, unalterable fact of life in the 18th century British world. Let us reason no more about it, but diligently improve the present opportunity for their instruction, he wrote. As an evangelist, he saw his role as helping to redeem slavery, not abolish it. And what better way to do so, he figured, than as a slave master himself, and not as a mere observer. Yet as it will be carried on whether we will or not, he rationalised, I should think myself highly favoured if I could purchase a good number of them in order to make their lives comfortable and lay a foundation for breeding up their posterity in the nurture and admonition of the Lord. The prospect of evangelising slaves might have excited Whitefield, but without doubt the financial incentives that came with slavery were never far from his mind. With, I think, a breathtaking callousness, he casually speculated that, quote, though liberty is a sweet thing to such as are born free, yet to those who never knew the sweets of it, slavery, perhaps, may not be so irksome. It's plain that hot countries cannot be cultivated without Negroes, he wrote, lamenting the profligate wastage of lives, white lives, in language that betrayed his default sense of racial superiority. What a flourishing country might Georgia have been had the use of them been permitted years ago? How many white people have been destroyed for want of them, and how many thousands of pounds spent to no purpose at all? In many ways, Whitefield was a product of his 18th century transatlantic time and place. Like all of us, he was unavoidably influenced without being inevitably determined by the prevailing attitudes and assumptions of the world that he lived in. Like all of us, he could exhibit sinful motivations and confounding contradictions. He embodied these especially vividly when it came to his involvement with slavery, one of the most just ever-present features of life in the British world at that time. He endorsed it and indeed expanded it, while also working to improve it in keeping with his view that it could function as a Christian institution. But while Whitefield devoted his life to proclaiming the good news of liberation from bondage to spiritual death for both black and white people, this concern for the liberty of slaves' souls never translated into advocating for their physical freedom. On some level, and at certain moments, he seemed to grasp that extolling the former freedom, spiritual liberation, without proclaiming the latter, entailed a profound contradiction. For instance, in the spring of 1748, he made a 2-month evangelistic side tour to Bermuda. He had especially high hopes of preaching to the resident slaves, but soon found himself navigating ethical waters, arguably more treacherous than the archipelago's shipwreck-filled coastline. He was happy for the chance to preach the gospel to them, but he quickly clarified it was a gospel message calibrated so as to, quote, not give them the least umbrage to behave imperiously to their masters, possibly betraying a measure of internal dissonance at this unevenly applied good news. He continued, if ever a minister in preaching needs the wisdom of the serpent to be joined with the harmlessness of the dove, it must be when discoursing to Negroes. Perhaps strangely to our ears, the overwhelming impression is that for all of the shortcomings in his theology and practice, America's slaves actually responded to Whitefield with overwhelming affection. On face value, his love for the slaves was genuine and invariably reciprocated. and news of his death was met with genuine grief amongst the slave population. One of the most prominent eulogies came from the pen of an unlikely source, Phyllis Wheatley, a 17-year-old black servant and poet who'd migrated to Boston from Africa 9 years earlier. She memorialised Whitefield in a poem as a British evangelist with a special affection for Americans in all of their diversity, especially African Americans. But despite this particular effort to burnish Whitefield's memory, there's little doubt his reputation in the ensuing years has suffered because of his engagement with slavery. In many ways, he shared in a racist culture that exploited the labour of a people considered to be inferior for its own commercial benefit, interpreting freedom to be a matter contingent upon the circumstances of race and birth and economic expediency. And yet, if the president of the University of Pennsylvania in 2020 might well have raised an eyebrow at one biographer of Whitefield who described him as the first great friend of the American Negro, we've also seen that many of Whitefield's 18th century contemporaries, whether slave or free, might well have raised an eyebrow at the university's decision to pull down his statue. What I'm suggesting is this. There's little doubt that glossing over Whitefield's sins of commission and omission about slavery runs the risk of presenting him in an unjustifiably flattering light. But the flip side is also true, that recasting his legacy exclusively in terms of a pro-slavery agenda in order to cancel his memory entirely is anachronistic. What lessons are there for us? Well, Whitefield's failures, clearly visible with the benefit of 3 centuries worth of hindsight, undoubtedly serve as a cautionary tale of the dangers of complicity with a prevailing culture's fallenness. But it also forces upon us the question, are there planks in our own spiritual lives that threaten to impair the clarity of our own moral vision? Managing to successfully elude the University of Pennsylvania's censure, was one-time slave owner Benjamin Franklin, on the grounds that he, in contrast to Whitefield, he changed course in his life and went on to become a leading abolitionist. Naturally, this raises several final, if ultimately unanswerable questions. Might Whitefield have embraced the abolitionist cause if he lived long enough to experience the initial wave of anti-slavery, abolitionist sentiment that began to capture the evangelical community's hearts and minds from the mid-1770s onwards? Whitefield had been dead for 5 years at this point. Would he have been any different if he'd lived a little longer? Might he have chosen to emancipate the 50 slaves still residing at the Bethesda orphanage at the time of his death? Might he have followed in fellow revivalist John Wesley's footsteps, who in 1791, 2 decades after Whitefield's death, famously urged the British parliamentarian William Wilberforce to pursue the end of slavery? That was the last letter that John Wesley ever wrote, was to Wilberforce, urging him on in this pursuit. Of course, as illuminating as answers to these questions would be, they remain tantalisingly out of reach for us. Rather than hypothesising, perhaps there's wisdom in casting all speculation aside and opting for the approach that Whitefield himself took in penning his own intended epitaph. Quote, "I am content to wait for the day of judgment, for the clearing up of my character. And after I am dead, I desire no other epitaph than this. Here lies G.W. What sort of a man he was, the great day will discover." "I thank your ladyship for the information concerning the Methodist preachers," replied the Duchess of Buckingham in a letter to a fellow noblewoman. Thanks but no thanks, as it turned out. The Methodists, she went on, were, quote, "strongly tinctured with impertinence and disrespect towards their superiors, perpetually endeavouring to level all ranks. Worst of all, the Duchess was particularly upset by the uncomfortable implications of the doctrine of original sin upon her own sense of innate superiority. Quote, "It's monstrous to be told that you have a heart as sinful as the common wretches that crawl on the earth. This is highly offensive and insulting, and I cannot but wonder that your ladyship should relish any sentiments so much at variance with high rank and good breeding." The certain ladyship on the receiving end of this candid correspondence was the then 34-year-old Selina Hastings, Countess of Hutingdon. Recently converted, Selina was keenly aware that her privileged status within British high society came with rich gospel opportunities. In practice, this meant inviting her peers to join her in listening to the famed evangelists like George Whitefield, whom she would later enlist as her personal chaplain, preach the gospel. For all of her misgivings, the Duchess of Buckingham went on, "Your ladyship does me infinite honour by your obliging inquiries after my health. I'm most happy to accept your kind offer of accompanying me to hear your favourite preacher," the favourite preacher being Whitefield. Selina was a winsome and persuasive ambassador for the gospel in rarefied aristocratic circles. Before long, she was renowned for making the most of every opportunity on a national scale. Described by one of her contemporaries as the Queen of the Methodists, her unique contribution lay in investing her considerable resources as a gospel patron. Her entrepreneurial energy was exceptional, establishing and overseeing a network of Calvinistic Methodists, her so-called connection, building chapels, and then populating them with a cadre of preachers and establishing a seminary to train future generations of evangelists. A tornado and a silver spoon wrapped into one, a 5'6" force of nature and the heiress of old money. The Countess of Hutingdon stood alongside the Wesley brothers, John and Charles, and Whitefield, as one of the most visible leaders of the 18th century evangelical revival. She was born on the 24th of August, 1707, in Northamptonshire. Although her upbringing was materially privileged, it was also filled with lots of relational dysfunction. Her aristocratic mother and father separated when she was only 6, and her mum relocated to France with Selina's baby sister, while she and her older sister were raised by their dad in England. When she was 17, Selina moved to Staunton Harold Hall in Leicestershire, a property that she inherited after her dad died. There she met, in 1728, married Theophilus Hastings, the 9th Earl of Huntingdon, who lived at nearby Donnington Hall. By early 1732, the couple already had 4 children. 3 more would follow in the ensuing years. Pregnancy took a heavy toll on Selina's health, and as was the custom at the time, on doctor's orders, she was sent to Bath, the town of Bath, to, quote, "take the waters," as a way of recuperating. From all account, the whole experience was medicinally underwhelming and socially nauseating. "The most stupid place I ever yet saw," she wrote. Her expeditions to the ancient Roman spa city would nonetheless leave a lasting impression on Selina, giving her a particular heart to reach what she styled the fine ladies of Bath with the gospel in coming years. During the first decade of her marriage, the Countess of Hutingdon was religious and philanthropic, but she was not yet converted. She found the sexual immorality and decadence that was so prevalent in her circles to be galling. But when a worthy cause presented itself, she was financially generous. For instance, when Thomas Coram wanted to establish a home and a school for London's deserted infants, as a mother of young children herself, Selina was one of the first to pledge her financial support. It wasn't until 1739 that Selina experienced spiritual regeneration. Initially, she joined John Wesley in worshipping at the Moravian congregation at Fetter Lane in London. At this point in her journey, the Countess identified herself with the Wesleys' Arminian brand of evangelicalism, renouncing unconditional predestination and embracing the possibility of entire sanctification. In 1741, she read John Wesley's recently published sermon on Christian perfection, and she was completely sold. The doctrine contained therein I hope to live and die by. It's absolutely the most complete thing I know, she wrote. But there was another major theological tributary that fed into the Methodist stream, known as Calvinism, one that embraced unconditional predestination and renounced perfection. And Selina regularly crossed paths with many of its prominent figures, including Whitefield and the Welsh itinerant Howell Harris. Whitefield, who'd recently engaged in a bruising public theological dispute with the Wesleys, one that would permanently split the Methodists along Arminian and Calvinist lines, he did his utmost to win Selina over. She wasn't persuaded, at least not for the moment. Within a few years, though, and Selina had begun to find Whitefield's position more compelling and Wesley's less so. In the midst of long-standing struggles with indwelling sin and a fragile sense of assurance, she discovered great comfort in God's promise to preserve those he had unconditionally chosen from before the foundation of the world. Whitefield's Calvinistic tabernacle at Moorfields, not Wesley's Arminian foundry, a quarter of a mile away, became her preferred London congregation. And so from this point onwards, for all of her affection for the Wesley brothers, her theological die was cast in a Whitefieldian Calvinist mould. Quote, her religious principles were strictly Calvinistic, reflected one contemporary, and the doctrines of grace were the marrow and life of her soul. The Countess of Hutingdon's convictions about God's exhaustive sovereignty and goodness would be put to the test over the course of her life. Selina would bury 6 of her 7 children, 4 of them in infancy and childhood. 2 died of smallpox within a few months of each other while at boarding school, just horrible. In 1746, she would also bury her husband. Theophilus had struggled with heart troubles for a number of years, but despite the best efforts of his concerned friends, he refused to seek medical advice. Eventually, the Earl relented and travelled to London for treatment, but just a few days before he departed, he had a premonition of his imminent demise, where, quote, death in the appearance of a skeleton stood at the bed's foot, and after standing for a while, untucked the bed clothes at the bottom. In his recounting of his eerie dream to his wife the next morning, the skeleton then crept up to the top of the bed and lay between him and his wife. Selina wrote to him a few days after he left for London. Her letter betrays not only her anxious state of heart and mind, but also her deep affection for her husband. I hope you will, my dear creature, if you should find yourself the least ill, will allow it not to be concealed from me. But unfortunately, Theophilus's dream proved prophetic. Selina wouldn't write or hear from her husband again. Just 2 weeks after that strange dream, he died of a stroke in 1746 while in London. And so the Countess of Hutingdon found herself widowed at the age of 39 and at a crossroads in her life. Overwhelmed by grief, for the next 4 months she was a virtual recluse and even contemplated withdrawing from society permanently. In early 1747, she consulted Howell Harris, the Welsh evangelist, about which was best, to live retired and give up all, or to fill her place. And in what would prove to be a pivotal conversation, Harris convinced her to live an active public life. From this point onwards, her mind was set. Quote, I dread slack hands in the vineyard, she wrote. We must all be up and doing. In many ways, Whitefield, and not Selina, was the obvious candidate for the role of Supremo of the Methodists, Calvinistic Methodists especially. Arguably one of the most famous personalities of the 18th century, Whitefield was a celebrity preacher and the public face of the revivals that were sweeping the transatlantic world. But first and foremost, Whitefield was an itinerant evangelist at heart, not an administrator. He had an allergic reaction to anything that threatened to restrict his mobility. He had no interest whatsoever in being tied down by the responsibility of overseeing societies. In his own mind, sowing the seed of God's word was his calling. The task of watering it was for others. In 1748, Whitefield returned to England after a 4-year stint in America. He was welcomed back ashore by Harris, who immediately whisked him away to spend time with Selina at her London home in Chelsea. As a peeress, Selina was entitled to appoint a number of personal chaplains, and she had Whitefield, who was known as the Prince of Pulpit Orators, in her sights as just the larger-than-life personality to reach her contemporaries within aristocratic society. And so over the summer, in 1748, she hosted a series of events to road test Whitefield's abilities amongst audiences of these rich and famous people, including, amongst others, Lord Bolingbroke and the former Chief Secretary of State, the Earl of Chesterfield. They embodied Selina's target audience. They were rich, they were famous, and they were unconverted. Whitefield's preaching was a hit. One person's verdict was, Whitefield is the most extraordinary man of our times. He has the most commanding eloquence I've ever heard in any person. Lord Chesterfield, was no less enthusiastic. Mr. Whitefield's eloquence is unrivaled, his zeal inexhaustible, and not to admire both would argue a total absence of taste. Selina was over the moon. If anything, her expectations were exceeded. She reported to one minister, I must tell you that I have had 2 large assemblies at my house of the mighty, the noble, the wise, and the rich to hear the gospel by Mr. Whitefield, and I have great pleasure in telling you they all expressed a great deal in hearing of him. Whitefield himself, no less optimistic after these gatherings, quote, I went home never more surprised at any incident in my life. The prospect of doing good to the rich that attend her ladyship's house is very encouraging. Who knows what God may do? To a fellow Methodist preacher, he wrote, the prospect of catching some of the rich in the gospel net is very promising. Whitefield and Selina were a perfect ministry match. And so soon afterwards, the Countess offered, and Whitefield accepted, her scarf as her personal chaplain. Always sure to adopt a posture of deference and humility towards his patroness, Whitefield's unexpected upward social mobility left him giddy with excitement. He would typically sign off on the title page of things that he published. He would, not to say that he had graduated from Oxford, but that he was the personal chaplain of the Countess of Hutingdon. If Whitefield knew himself well enough to realise that presiding over the Calvinist Methodist Society was not his forte, then the newly appointed chaplain also knew just the person for the job, Selina. Quote, perhaps the Lord is fitting your ladyship for some new work, he wrote in May 1749. 6 months later, he was more direct. A leader is wanting. This honour hath been put upon your ladyship by the great head of the church. The Countess of Hutingdon assumed the organisational role that Whitefield had declined. Her entrepreneurialism was a critical factor in bringing an evangelical witness to the English aristocracy. Just as John Wesley established and oversaw a multitude of Methodist societies, fashioned in his own theological image, likewise Selina would establish and oversee societies of her own, known as Lady Huntington's Connection. These were similarly fashioned in her own Calvinistic theological image. If Selina was empress of her new connection, then Whitefield was her prime minister. Whitefield's preferred description, that she was more like a good archbishop with her chaplains around him, perhaps better captures her desire to remain a loyal member of the established church and avoid creating a rival denomination. This is eventually what transpired in her twilight years. Beginning in 1750 and extending over the next 4 decades, Lady Huntington's preachers proclaimed the gospel at a constellation of chapels throughout Wales and England. These chapels eventually grew to 64 in number, and provided places of worship where evangelical men could preach without the strictures often imposed upon them by the hierarchy of the Church of England. Her initial practice was to lease properties with chapels attached, but in time this made way for building chapels from the ground up. Proximity to water-based leisure and recuperation was a recurring feature of the chosen locations for these chapels, whether it be up-and-coming seaside resort towns like Brighton or fashionable spa towns like Bath and Tunbridge Wells. In Georgian Bath, a place where Selina had a long history, as I've alluded to, and longed to see transformed by the gospel, she chose to employ her favourite style of architecture, the Gothic. Opened in 1765 with much fanfare, the Bath Chapel was created with her target audience's tastes in view. It also had a unique feature, a seat located immediately inside the front door, curtained off from the rest of the sanctuary, where high-ranking Church of England clergy could listen to Selina's preachers incognito. Much of the stigma initially associated with the Methodist it sort of wore off as time went on, but the prospect of a bishop, quote, undergoing the dreadful disgrace of being seen in such a place meant that this little corner, known as Nicodemus Corner, was often occupied. The Countess of Hutingdon was careful to schedule public gatherings at times that didn't conflict with Church of England worship services. But in retrospect, conflict and eventually separation from the established church was inevitable. It happened like this in 1779, just 2 weeks after she opened her latest chapel at Spa Fields in London. Thomas Hawace, an ordained Church of England clergyman, appointed as another of Selina's personal chaplains. She had a bunch of them, not just Whitefield, but a few others. Had his right to preach challenged in court by the curate of the local parish church. The prosecution case was simple, as it turned out persuasive. A chapel with seating for thousands, a public entrance and tickets sold for seating could not in any reasonable manner be construed as a private chapel. And so the tenuous legal foundation upon which Selina had simultaneously attempted to build her connection and remain loyal to the Church of England, it all crumbled. The court not only decided against the Countess, but also established a precedent for future ecclesiastical litigation against her chaplains. And so she had a decision to make. Faced with this decision to either close her chapels or register them under the Toleration Act as dissenting meeting houses, in 1782 she reluctantly chose the latter. Quote, "I am to be cast out of the church for what I've been doing these 40 years past, speaking and living for Jesus Christ," she lamented, with a dose of defiance, I think, added in. While some of her preachers followed her into dissent, most, like Hawace, remained within the Church of England, and in the process contributed in part to the Calvinistic Methodist failure to flourish to the same degree as Wesley's Arminian wing. The Countess of Huntingdon's chapels multiplied, though, in their heyday, at such a rate that the demand for preachers began to outpace supply. This immediate shortage, coupled in 1768 with Oxford University's decision to expel 6 students for holding Methodistical tenets, provided Selina with the impetus to challenge Oxford and Cambridge's monopoly on training ministers, and she established her own seminary, her own nursery for preachers. It was called Trevecca College. Originally, it was a rundown farmhouse near Howell Harris's home in Wales, and the Countess of Huntingdon single-handedly funded every facet of the college's operations, from its initial renovation to faculty and staff wages to providing full bursaries for all of the students. She hoped, perhaps naively, that the Church of England would look kindly on Trevecca's graduates when it came to ordination, but in practice it didn't really turn out that way. Not many of them were ordained. Trevecca opened on the Countess's 61st birthday. It was, in effect, a gift from herself to the wider church. Whitefield presided over the opening ceremonies. By this stage, the Countess only had 2 surviving children of her own, and she was estranged from one of them. In many ways, Trevecca's students would become her own spiritual offspring, and they certainly saw her in a maternal, if not somewhat matriarchal light. She regarded her young men as her sons, as her family, declared one Trevecca alumni in a sermon preached in her honour soon after she died in 1791, died the same year that Wesley did. With what affection and tenderness, wisdom and prudence have I heard her address the young men in the study around her. How she has warned, cautioned, reproved, comforted and encouraged us like a true mother in Israel. If the generosity of wealthy female patrons like Phoebe was integral to the flourishing of the gospel in the first century, then the generosity of wealthy patrons like the Countess of Hutingdon was no less integral to the flourishing of the gospel in the 18th century. For when I gave myself up to the Lord, said Selina, I likewise devoted to him all my fortune. The generation of preachers she helped raise up attested to her willingness to lay down at the foot of the cross her honours, titles, distinction and fortune. We're used to aristocrats forming their own regiments or cricket teams, wrote one biographer. But an aristocrat who started her own church is in a class apart. Indeed she was. If Wesley and Whitefield are celebrated as founding fathers of contemporary evangelicalism, then Selina was no less the movement's founding mother. The evangelical revival of the 18th century might never have gained the acceptance that it did apart from the endeavours of the Countess of Hutingdon, observed another biographer. The Countess used her unquestionable influence in the higher circles of the land, even in the royal court, to throw the cloak of her protection over the prominent preachers of the day and over the fledgling Methodist movement itself. In fact, the verdict from the royal court was nothing short of glowing. Quote, there is something so noble, so commanding, and withal so engaging about Selina that I am quite captivated with her ladyship, commented none other than King George III. I wish there was a Lady Huntington in every diocese in my kingdom.